Why is the UAP community lacking diversity? Race representation in the unexplored dimensions of the UAP conversation is our focus in today's podcast. Our guest is Dr. Stephen C. Finley, professor and chair of African and African American Studies at Louisiana State University, a scholar whose work bridges religion, race, philosophy, and the paranormal. Why have Black voices historically been excluded from mainstream UFO science and space research? And while representation is growing, why does it still remain disproportionately low today? How do centuries of exclusion from government programs and systematic gatekeeping in media still shape who gets seen, heard, and believed? And what might we discover if we dare to take African and African American spiritual cosmology seriously in our search for non-human intelligence? This is not about visibility. This is about truth, power, and what it takes to rebuild a narrative that reflects all human experiences, not just a selected few. Join us as we get rebelliously curious.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. This is a topic I've wanted to tackle for a while, looking at diversity within the UFO landscape and even in the science communities, where we see it from the past and where we see it today. We unfortunately we have voices from many diverse communities, but we don't have many all the time that are in the forefront. We do have a lot that are behind the scenes, and it is growing and changing since past science communities were predominantly Caucasian. But now we are seeing this diversity, but I think how we understand diversity is still growing and learning within these various fields. So thank you so much first for joining me on the podcast.
It's wonderful being here.
So I would first like to tackle this UFO topic of the lack of diversity and the lack of Black or African American community within the space. So, from your perspective as a professor in both, first it was religious studies and the African and African American studies at Louisiana State University, how do you see the current landscape and why there is a lack of African American diversity currently?
Thank you for that question. And of course, as you know, I'm trying to address with my work and fill the gaps where we don't hear any diverse voices and communities in these discussions of UAP, UFOs. I sometimes like the term UFO because it's historic. And in the groups that I study, that's the term that they use. And I'll just say that I think the lack of diversity in UFO communities and conversations lacks the diversity in academia. I mean, academia is so, these departments and disciplines are so cut off from one another. But even within those, I think if you're not a scholar who's studying what some might understand as mainstream, which is always white, then you're siloed, and what you do or what I do is something other than mainstream academia. Where I argue largely my work is very much mainstream and normative. It's just I have to fight to make it clear how my work fits in the broader academic milieu, and sometimes to demonstrate that it's even older and more normative than these other traditions. So in many ways, I think it mirrors the sort of exclusion and silos that we find in academia, which many people, including me, are trying to break through.
I 100% I agree with that. As a woman, though, and also I'm not a Black woman. I'm a Caucasian European descent woman. You still see and can relate to a degree of understanding of a lack of taking seriously in these departments, right? Or having to fight for some type of acknowledgement in these areas. Now, when I look at it from more of a female perspective, and again, more of a Caucasian perspective from the way that I was been grown up and the influences around me, when I look at the science community, a lot of people ask me, well, why isn't there a lot of women in UFOs? And why isn't there, in the UFO topic, why isn't there a lot of women in science? There is now, obviously more in the past compared to the past, but I do answer this question by looking at education. And I'm curious to see if this would be parallel within the African American community. When I see it, I could be wrong, but my perception of it is that unfortunately this was dominated by a Caucasian, white, male, affluent community. If you had the money, and still to this day, you're able to then dabble in metaphysics. You're able to dabble in the mysteries because you have the time and the luxury to do it. And also, it was taken more seriously, looking at it from a male white perspective. And I know that these are such triggering words for some people, and they're not meant to be. They're meant to be conversational and how people see this perception. Because all I can hear is some people I know in the back of my mind, especially some white men saying, Chrissy, like, and it's more about this perception because of our lack of education. Women weren't allowed to go to school. We weren't allowed to proceed to go into these areas of science and education further because we weren't allowed to. Do you see that that parallels from somewhat of a female experience to, and not saying they are very different, I should mind you saying that, but do you see some similarities within how both of these communities are trying to, with gender and then also with race, trying to achieve more within areas of STEM?
I do see similarities between how women, people of color, and African Americans specifically are trying to achieve more in the academy and in these discourses that we're navigating and talking about right now. I do see, and I have to say this, I do see Black experience as irreducible to other experiences. I do think there's something about anti-Blackness that is structured in American discourses and institutions that make it sort of a unique situation, especially, given slavery and lynching and hundreds of years of discourses about Black inferiority. And so that kind of thing has affected who is authoritative, who's understood as intellectual, and so on. And then when you put that together with social forces, there aren't very many of us in the academy in general. African Americans might be 13, 14% of the population, depending on the data you're viewing. But in the academy, we're only 4, maybe 5%. And that includes Black schools. So if you put, HBCUs together with other schools, liberal arts universities, they call them PWIs, predominantly white institutions like LSU where I work, we're still only 4 to 5% of the population of tenured or tenure track faculty. Now, when you talk about being full professors like I am, that cuts that, especially an African-American male, that's going to be less than 1%. And so, when you're talking about having the opportunity for diversity in science and to study religion, philosophy, the social sciences, and when you look at how marginalized this conversation is in general, as you and I know, there aren't going to be many people like me who are in these spaces trying to make the conversation much more diverse and trying to argue that these African American traditions aren't secondary, but are a very normative, essential part of the phenomena as we study it and as we see it in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. It doesn't just happen to one type of group of people. This is a human experience, especially in the UFO topic.
Correct.
We have seen for sure there is a lack of diversity within science. Immensely, there's a lack of it. Trying to interview people on my podcast of all different races, all different types of genders, it's extremely hard. And so having these conversations are important to see that there is diversity and that we need more of it, and explaining that there's such a lack of it, like you said. Currently, with the DEI initiatives being cut from President Trump, and it's affecting the science community immensely. Can I ask, if you don't mind saying, is there any way that you've seen this being affected through, the Louisiana State University or anywhere else through your communities within the African American communities, but also within the science communities? If you're seeing a massive cutback when it comes to just DI diversity and equity funding and removal of it entirely, you'll see the removal of so many African American people and other people of diversity, because a lot of them are running those areas because they understand what it means to implement new diversity and what needs to be done. Not saying Caucasian people don't, but they'll have a better handle on it.
Yeah.
So you're seeing those people are being cut. And then you're also seeing that there isn't many people already that have diversity within the community. So how is it affecting you and everyone else around you?
So my perspective is slightly different because the anti-DEI movement currently in this state and on the national scene, I do read as a form of anti-Blackness. At the same time, DEI, affirmative action, never really benefited African Americans very much. 75 to 80% of the beneficiaries were actually white women.
Really?
One research, correct.
Wow.
And so in academia, it's even worse. There's one study done by two Baylor economics professors that argued, and it's a broad, they studied literally hundreds of universities, from Research One universities, which is the top tier, like where I work, to second tier, and then high-level master's universities. And there were probably about 1,000 schools or more, up to 1,500 that they studied. And what they actually concluded is that schools that had a chief diversity officer, the numbers of African-American faculty actually went down by 6% rather than up. And so diversity is really, really tricky. So you have these schools during the diversity era that just ended that really weren't invested in the numbers of African-American faculty in particular. They were invested in diversity offices that functioned as their outward-looking commitment, outward-facing commitment to diversity, which is very different from actual diversity. Hiring folks who look like me, who do the kind of work that I do, which fills important gaps and creates new discourses. But schools just weren't invested in that. They were invested in the appearance and the narratives of diversity. Like I said, when schools invest in diversity offices, the number of Black faculty actually goes down, not up.
That's insane. And what's the point then if you're not going to have a spread of different diversity?
I agree.
To implement different thinking, right?
Every school wants to appear progressive. And that's the point. That's how they sell themselves to students. That's how they sell themselves to donors. But that's very different from having real equity and real difference among faculty.
It's very true because you see it in different industries. I remember when, the Black, we've had different types of movements that have obviously happened. But when I think it was just before COVID, there was a huge conversation, obviously, of Black Lives Matter, but it was a big conversation in Canada. I'm based in Toronto, within the music industry, and I'm actually surrounded by it, surprisingly, with different friends in the business. And I won't say who, because I don't want to call it different labels or get myself slapped with something, but probably more of that. But it's a very large label in Canada, and someone called me that works higher up there and said, "Chrissy," and I said, how are you doing, by the way? And they were like, "It's great, but this Black Lives movement is wonderful, but we don't want to be tokenized, and we're getting tokenized right now." And it was sad to watch. And they were talking to different friends, saying, you should take this offer because you are a Black male in a business that's predominantly white in Canada, and you are given a step up. And the question is, was it based on your merit of your education, or was it based on the perceived value of being able to do something right, the label doing something right in context of what they thought was right during a time of a movement? And I would hate to use the word trendy, but that's what it felt like, right? And being being of different ethnicity is not a trend. And so I just remember feeling so hard because it's like, what decisions do they make? So they took the decision to step up, but it was to say, like, don't tokenize me in
Again,
this position. And it's so hard to see your friends going, am I getting this because of the quality of work I do, which is unbelievable. For sure, their work stands out among most Canadian artists in this
mhm.
country. But were they given a title and a raise at the label because it was during a movement and they were utilizing it? It's just so hard, and I can imagine you see that as well in many different
I do.
communities.
But I'm going to cut against the grain again
Okay, go for it. I love it. Go for it.
because the
Cheers.
presumption is that everyone else who is hired, especially if they're white, are hired because they're qualified. And nothing is further from the truth, especially here in the United States, in the American Academy, is largely mediocre. And so if we dispense with the myth of meritocracy, then we understand that people get all kinds of jobs from the highest to the lowest because of the networks that they belong to. And that these networks are racialized and gendered and classed in ways that if you don't fit those particular categories, you don't have access to the same opportunities and resources as people. And I see it all the time, right? This isn't just a narrative. This is how it works. People get jobs. I mean, look at the current administration. People get jobs because of the networks they're in and who they know. And so, you know, nobody else complains about being tokenized. They just accept the resources and the opportunity, right? So, you know, this narrative about people being tokenized by these programs that are meant to expand the difference in the academy or in a corporation based on disability or gender or race. You know, these are red herring. These are arguments that aren't empirical because how it really works has everything to do with the networks you're in and who you're in. Except the only acceptable narrative is that it's all merit based. And we just know that that's never been true.
It's true. It's who you know. There's so much of that as well. And it's such a game, unfortunately, because there's people that are not always that great at socializing. And so for them, it's very, very challenging, but they're academically very bright and very smart, but they have challenges. And again, I speak a lot about neurodiversity in this
That's
podcast.
exactly right. I had that in mind too.
Yeah, and you have people that have autism in all different degrees on the spectrum. But I have friends that are have autism, and they don't like to be around big crowds. They have a challenge with it, but very bright individuals, you know, like and have so much to offer and to contribute. But I agree that does need to change. You know, just because your buddy's doing well doesn't mean that you deserve to do the same thing. You might join along and helping them and raising them up and supporting them, but you shouldn't be doing the exact same job if you don't know what you're doing.
I agree.
So,
I agree. And to
so
your last point, you know, I'm as shy and introverted as they come. So
well,
I
I
don't,
wouldn't say that.
look. I really am. I have to work really hard to perform, you know, in these kind of settings, which I enjoy, but it takes work for me.
That's fair.
Where an
You do.
extrovert, they just love the attention and being in front of the camera and the microphone. I have to be really prepared on the inside. And often when you see me in interviews, I'm drinking a little scotch or I'm smoking a cigar. And sometimes it's part of my style, but it's also to mitigate being camera shy.
That's fair, but fair enough. I would say the same to my context. I'm actually like an introvert extrovert. When I get on a podcast, I love talking to people and I love being in a room, but I don't like going out all the time. Like I go out with purpose. And then if it's too much, if I'm out for a day or two, then I have to go back and retreat to like re-energize, like the Energizer Bunny. You know, I can only go for so long until I get to power up again. So I can feel that there's people that can go out every night and do those things every day and good for them, but I just can't keep up. It's too emotionally draining for me. I would like to talk about media and visibility. Do you think that there's like there's systematic biases within media? I would say from a North American perspective or even just American perspective, because our media is actually very different in Canada. And I obviously watch both. And the debrief is more of an American media outlet. But do you see the systematic biases? And if so, have they changed drastically from the past? And what are you seeing currently now?
So the question of media bias really is it seems like an obvious question because I want to obviously just say yes, but it's also really complicated. Um, from my perspective, I mean, there are all kinds of media biases where let me just use myself and my community of origin, where we're talking about Black achievement, that's underrepresented in the media. Where we're talking about Black social matters and social problems, that's overrepresented by at least 25%, especially when we're talking about criminality, for example. And so those are obvious media biases from my perspective. Now, I don't know if that has anything to do with the lack of attention to these Black UAP UFO traditions we're talking about. But I would suspect that uh, the reason because race is so central to them that it could be part of it. Why we don't hear from them as much, why there's not as much coverage. Although I would like to say, and this interview is an example of that, that is changing a little.
Yeah, I was going to ask that's what I was going to lead into was the UFO topic. And if we're seeing within experiencers and researchers within the UFO community, because they are very unrepresentative in media. I unfortunately don't see as many within the UFO topic. I think it is growing within science to some degree, but again, in this UFO topic, we don't see a lot of diversity at all. Really, it's generally white women and white men, unfortunately, well,
I
consistently.
agree with you about the lack of diversity. I think where the diversity is increasing is in not necessarily in the academics. So scholars of religion and Black studies like me or scientists like a lot of my friends, but in the area of experiencers. I think those who claim, you know, UFO experiences, and you probably know, lots of folks, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. We are starting to see the formation of those kinds of groups that emphasize the sort of uniqueness of particular experiences. Like there are maybe one or two African American UFO experiencer groups that I'm aware of now, which wouldn't have happened even just 5 years ago.
Not at all. I remember thinking I've only would go to conferences in my early 20s. I'm 41 now and would generally, well, mind you, I was really one of the younger people there too back then because everybody was Caucasian and generally over 60. So we are seeing still somewhat the truth now, depending on what conference you go to, but there is such a diversity of ages, cultures, and genders now throughout. I want to look at a spiritual framework around religious studies and cosmologies that have really um, created a framework within the Black community. Can you speak to maybe those religious studies and those cosmologies and how it's referenced in the past and currently where we see it in the future from the African American community?
So the question of cosmology in African American community is really a difficult one, precisely because of what we're discussing. African Americans are just so diverse in terms of how they see the world, how they experience the world. So I really can't answer that succinctly. I'll just say that African Americans range from those who might be atheists but still religious, all the way to those who believe in nature religions or paganism, to those who believe African Americans originated or Black people in general out in space in the cosmos on other planets. Meaning the range of cosmologies or cosmogonies is really diverse, even though some might argue that African Americans are predominantly Christian. And even though that may be true, that still is only part of the story. Because even when we talk about African American Christians, I always argue we leave parts of it out. Because being Christian is only a part of the world building of what they use to make worlds that are meaningful to them. I know people who go to church on Sundays who might be at a tarot reader on Tuesday, for example. Now they're Christians. They might even be deacons or mothers in the church. And what I'm saying is the scholarship says that this is actually quite common and quite normative. And if you saw the movie Sinner, which came out recently, which if you haven't, I do recommend it. One of the consultants on that was a friend of mine named Dr. Yvonne Chirot. Just heard from her last week, in fact. She was a consultant about The Conjure in that particular movie. But one of the things she argues in her book called Black Magic is that in 19th century, African-American Christianity in the 19th century was indistinguishable from African-American conjurational and magical traditions. They were so intertwined that they couldn't be disentangled. Now, in churches, they may not want to deal with that, right? Because that's an uncomfortable conversation. But in reality, this is what has always happened.
And would you say voodoo would be attached to that? Because I believe that was a stem from African-American community. I believe it was stem from an African community.
So I don't know as much about voodoo. I would say much more hoodoo, which is a much more North American, African-American tradition. Whereas voodoo, I would see is much more Haiti, much more Catholic, whereas hoodoo be much more Protestant, much more North American, and so on. But that's not to say that those elements don't show up in African American culture among those who are in any, practice any number of religious traditions. And the real key is here that they don't see conflicts among those traditions. They may not talk about it openly, but these are all the things that they use to build meaningful worlds in the context of a world that's super complicated and changing just like that every day.
For sure. Leaning into metaphysics, leaning into the
exactly
supernatural. Right.
That's right.
When we look at colonization, it's such a word now, depending on, I use it consistently because I don't find it to be a trigger word to me because that's just history. That's just what has happened around the world. Gosh, we even talk about colonizing Mars now, right? But when we're looking at historically the horrific things that colonization has done around the world, how has this, when we look at colonization within the UFO topic, how has that been represented? When we look at things, even just like with religious studies, like even looking at Christianity, I would imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that colonization has played a huge part in how different African American communities maybe obviously view themselves, but you view the UFO phenomenon through influence.
So let me think just for a moment about colonization, because we know it had a major impact on the West, the development of the West, colonization of Asia, especially South Asia and Africa. And I think with respect to African American traditions, some folks even understand African American communities as colonized or internally colonized. So the system of historic slums, or what some might call ghettos, as colonies that are exploited in the same way as classical colonialism went from Europe to Asia, Africa, and so on. And so I think one of the effects that all of that and other forms of violence have had on African Americans in these traditions is they've had to look outside of this particular material realm to make meaning out of their life. So they're looking to the cosmos much more, because everything down here is so super saturated with anti-Blackness, right? Everything here has been colonized by white supremacy. And so these traditions they're looking to Mars and to Venus, or if you're Sun Ra, you're looking out to space, to Saturn. And so I call this transcendent Blackness. I actually talk about it in my book. And it becomes, looking to the cosmos becomes a way of re-envisioning Black identity and origins, given colonialism and slavery and Jim Crow here on the earth. And so the two definitely are connected and related. At the same time, I think looking to the cosmos and re-envisioning Black identity as something that is cosmic in its meaning and origin also, I think, empowers folks. It gives them a sense of hubris. an identity to face this world and the challenges of this world. So it's not, it's not just transcendence, it's also immanence. It's not just the other world, it's also this world. And they're kind of intertwined and go together and work together.
Yeah, when I spent some time in Tanzania, I really saw the influence of Christianity, staying in a specific community just outside of Arusha, working with an orphanage. And the influence of religion was so strong. I was actually very surprised in how strong it was because it was the first time being in Africa myself. And it was like such a wonderful experience. And being throughout all Tanzania, Christian side, and then also being in areas that were more Muslim as well. But Arusha is predominantly Christian, and spending time and, sitting in the orphanage and then putting in, DVDs or even VHS, and it was Christian music, but in tribal attire. And it was just like it was a music video. And I remember thinking, wow, like this is so much more of an influence in that community than it even had in my community growing up, which was still generally Christian around me. And I thought that was very interesting. And my mom and I discussed it because, you know, looking at it from our perspective, you would think stereotypically that we would be probably more embedded into a Christian philosophy, but it was very much embedded in the area that I was in. Not saying everybody, because I don't want to generalize, but within the communities that I met within Arusha, it was pretty predominant when I traveled around. And I was surprised with it. Is mainly is what I'm saying.
I'm never surprised. I mean, colonialism and missionization have always gone hand in hand. And when you talk about creating new communities, converts, they tend to be more conservative, right? If they have been missionized and colonized like that. And I mean, it's just one of the dynamics that missionization is almost near complete. I mean, it doesn't totalize identities. I mean, as you could see, there's still some of their identity that still comes through. But it's a powerful force in terms of how, especially if you're saying, if you're coming with force, power, weapons, resources, and so on, and you're saying this way, this God is the right one, yours is evil, right? I mean, that's a lot of motivation there to internalize and assimilate that kind of narrative, and it's really hard to overcome. I mean, how do you overcome that? Once you assimilate that and you come to see that as your perspective now, how does one overcome that?
Yeah, and it is. And we went to the largest slave port in Tanzania, and it was something that my mom and I were just like, it opened up our eyes immensely. It's not like we're very, we find to be ourselves very cultured and very diverse, but when you're in those positions and you're seeing what was happening and you're standing in those moments of history and you're with people around you of all different diversity, but mainly from the Black community, you shake your head, and then you see the horrors, the mass horrors of the treatment. And so like anything, you become an ally, and you should be. We all should be generally allies for each other. I believe that, but you become even more of one because you see the massive amounts of hurt and sorrow and pain that a specific community went because of greed and corruption and religion, obviously at times.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I wish more of us were allies and saw our responsibility to others in that same way. Unfortunately, especially in this day and age, I think there's sort of a consolidation in the other direction, and that's painful, and that's tough to see because from my perspective, politically, socially, and otherwise, I want the most freedoms for the broadest range of people. That's just not the age we're living in, where that's the dominant perspective.
Yeah, you're right. And understanding what freedom actually means. Because I think even that term has just been co-opted in so many ways politically, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Because freedom means many different things in many different cultures. I have family of mine that were under the USSR, control for the longest period of time. And I think they were 18 when they, were actually free, living in Romania. So, and I was sitting in Romania speaking with them, and asking like, what was the first thing you did when you had freedom? When you were able to to think outside of what the USSR was telling you to do. And they said I went to school. And I just, was like, wow, most people you would think would travel and leave. But the community that I was in, they all went to school. And I think that that's amazing because they were able to hire their education, better themselves, and the first thing they chose was academia, which is like wonderful to
That
see.
makes sense to me.
When we're looking at systematic distrust within the government, how does the African American community, would you say, in general, view the government, even currently, and then also surrounding the UFO topic related to government?
Yeah, yeah. Well, when we talk about government mistrust and ideas of secrecy and disclosure, you know, we can think about it in a general sense, but then you have to add layers on top of that for African Americans who have always felt like they've lived existences where the ultimate truth was hidden from them, especially the truth of who they are. And if you talk to African Americans, African American vernacular culture, you'll find this, narratives about why Black people don't show up in the history books, why when they invented this technology or that technology, nobody knows about it, and so there are layers for that. Then when you add to that the sort of esoteric traditions like the ones I study, it's even greater distrust of the government. Not to the extent where they're anti-government. I haven't seen that, but certainly a mistrust of disclosure, because these traditions that I study, and we're talking again about UFOs here, for them, the UFO represents Black people, right? The UFO points to the intellect and technology of Black people. So if you look at from these groups, you're part of the community and their history where they've been enslaved and systematically oppressed. Why would the government want anybody to know that these, in fact, weren't just slaves or the descendants of slaves, but people who understood mathematics and technology thousands of years ago, who were connected to the cosmos, right? And so that's how they're going to see it. That the government really should be talking to them if they want to understand the phenomena, but they won't. They won't because it's not in their best interest. Because then you have to look at Black people very differently. That's how a lot of these groups understand secrecy and the government tied to their own identities and UFOs and the cosmos.
Why do you think some of these groups have not come forward to larger, and not saying they haven't, because they probably have, and we should ask the same question to conferences, but why aren't they working together right now? And there might be a lack of asking them to attend, and there also might be a lack of understanding they even exist.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of it, but I also think the answers and reasons are diverse. From my perspective, the main reason is that secrecy in these African American religious groups for them protects them. Like it's a way of, like, if they put all this information out there, if they start working with other groups, then in their minds this makes them vulnerable to forces who might not want to see their flourishing. And so, and that's the way secrecy and concealment works in a lot of groups, not just African Americans. It's a way of protecting themselves and their communities. On the other hand, you have groups like the Nation of Islam who argue the government should be talking to them because they're the ones who know what the UFO phenomena really is. And that phenomena for them is intimately connected to their particular religious group. So there are a lot of reasons, a lot of different reasons why cooperation doesn't happen. And then I say on the flip side, I would say that I don't know that we've seen the kind of respect and regard for religion in general And in particular, these religious groups, these Black religious groups for whom UFOs are central. Like we still see them, and I mean by we, I mean the culture in general, as sort of off, in space somewhere, to turn a metaphor intentionally. They don't regard them as having something real to offer, science, technology, and so on. They think religious folks are nutty. I mean, that's the flip side. And I think religion has a lot to offer, but I'm a scholar of religion, right? I'm not someone in the general community or someone else who doesn't really understand how religion functions. I don't think they have that high regard for religion in the same way they do science. In fact, I know they don't.
Interesting. And would you say that because you have different communities, obviously, depending on your race, you can really follow any religion if you choose to, personally and through community. But when we're looking at, say, the Catholic religion, and then looking at these groups that have their own religious undertones that are not related to Catholic, we're seeing conflict of interest. Then, aren't we, in those ideals? So they would push it away.
I'm not sure what the conflicts of interest are. And you talking about between like religion and science? Is that a conflict?
No, if you're saying these religious groups that are, looking at the UFO topic, and they're coming from Black communities, that if it's Islam or if it's just related from Islam, but they have their own type of hierarchy or fundamental religion, but that's adjacent to UFO. But then we have like a Catholic religion. And if I was part of the Black community and I was Catholic, I probably wouldn't align to those religious ideologies. So is that why? And maybe this is just my ignorance. Would that be then a form of technically could colonization could be a reference to that because I have a doctorate at a different religion that I'm now not going to look at this other religion or perspective because I think that is just woohoo.
I think people integrate the idea of UFOs in their traditional religious ideas in very different ways, and some people are more open to it than others. I think also, how religions functions, how they're structured is different. Catholic Church is very hierarchical. Not all religions are like that. You have some folk religions that have no clergy class as such, no creeds as such in general, or nature religions. And so, I mean, it really depends on the kind of religion. But I see African American religion in general as being able to incorporate all kinds of ideas, which it has historically, and being very, very fluid. Now, the dominant guarantors of those traditions aren't going to admit that. But when we see what people are actually doing on the ground, right, in the masses, what we call popular religion, they're doing all kinds of things with all kinds of ideas, including UFOs and conjure and tarot and the occult, and they're not finding any conflict in all of that. Now, talk about it openly, and people may not admit that, but in my work, I know it happens regularly. I mean, I hope that answers the question again, because religion is just very, very diverse,
Oh,
right?
for
Just like,
sure.
and so
It is.
it's
And I don't want to just put it into in just to generalize it because it's not. It's so diverse. Especially when we get into related to culture, right? And to ethnicities. Um, if Are there any misconceptions you think that within the UFO community that it has within the African American community, and then in general, and then also is there any misconceptions you think that the African American community has about the UFO community?
Yeah, let me start with the latter. I still think in African American communities, they see idea of UFOs, even in these um, Black religious traditions, as gibberish. Like I think African Americans, by and large, still aren't on board with, say, groups like the Nation of Islam. I just want to name some for you, or the United Nuwabian Nation of Moors, or the UFO twins, who are two Black women, or United Nation of Islam, or Sun Ra, or any of these Black traditions where UFOs or transport, right, cosmic transport is significant. I still don't think African Americans, by and large, are necessarily on board with that. And so, I mean, I don't know about misconceptions. Um, So they can respect, for example, the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, and still sort of reject this idea of UFOs that are central to the Nation of Islam. And I think that's one of the things that happened. They can love Sun Ra, think he's a brilliant philosopher, poet, and jazz artist, but still think, they can't necessarily get, with his idea of transport to Saturn, right? And what that means for African Americans. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And I don't know that I can speak for misconceptions from white communities. I think if I was to venture one, it's that the UFO phenomena in the United States is a white phenomenon, right? But I don't even know if I would go that far, because I even hear some of them talk about Native American traditions and so on. But still, to a large extent, I still think they think it's largely a white tradition. Although I have to be fair, because I even see that changing.
Yeah, slowly. I would say that maybe a misconception from the media perspective
Okay.
would be that some of these related could be cults, right? We do see that where if they consider the religion to be more of a cult than it being a religion, and so I think it gets it gets
But may I
jumbled.
jump back in here?
Oh yeah, please do. Yes,
Because
yes.
I think you're right, and this is why most scholars of religion don't use the term cult, which is a negative term that really became popularized probably around the 1950s, around the Korean War. And so it also has a racialized tinge to it, a racialized sense to it, because it was a term that was anti-Asian in its inflection. And so these vernacular movements, especially among white communities that were looking to the East for some of their inspiration. I'm thinking in part, the hippies. I'm not even sure if that's a word we're supposed to use, but the hippies, it was sort of a term that that had a negative sense of the Asian influence. And so we rarely use the term. There's a small group of scholars of religion who do. I disagree with them. I don't think there's any such thing as a cult. I think they're all religions. I think they follow similar patterns at times. And I think cult is really a political term. It's used for smaller religions, newer religions, or religions we just don't like. If something happens in religion that we don't like, we say it must be a cult. Otherwise, I think emerging religions is a much more appropriate way of looking at some of these smaller and newer religions. And you're exactly right. They do tend to call these religions cults, but for precisely the reasons that I mentioned. Right? They're newer, they're smaller, they don't understand them, they don't like them, they're uncomfortable with them. Whereas they don't call mainstream religious cults,
Fair enough.
where things happen often, violence and so on in similar ways.
Yeah, brutality is usually that marker for cult. And what we see it in many different religions,
Exactly.
right? So it's a very good point. It's a great point. I want to go back to UFO twins because I think just for people that are listening, they might know some of these religions or they also know might some of the references, but I have never heard UFO twins. If you don't mind breaking that down and who they are and
Well,
and what they represent.
sure, sure. UFO twins, of course, is the name that Erling and Shirlene Wallace gave to themselves. It was one of them claimed to have had an experience with what they call the galactics, the galactics. And by the way, when they talk about what these galactics look like, and that is Erling and Shirlene, they say they look like beautiful Black women. So this alien other, whatever it was, they claim to have an encounter with, for them look like beautiful Black women, and those are their words, beautiful Black women. And so they wrote a book. I think it's called I have it at home, from mother ship, from motherland to mothership. So motherland ostensibly probably signifies Africa, and then of course mothership. And so they're connecting, I guess, Black experience for them also to UFOs. I think they live in the Arlington, Dallas area right now. I've had some contact with them. I haven't interviewed them, although in the past I was supposed to. And when you do a job like mine, where administration takes up so much of your time and energy, things fall through the cracks.
Well, I'd love to come with you when you do that.
When I get to
Let me
so
know.
I'm literally 3 books behind. And so the book where I will do a chapter on the UFO twins is 3 books out. I have one that I'm trying to finish, one that I have to finish that's overdue, and then there's that book. And, being a chair of a new department, where there's so much work building the department from scratch and raising money, finding ways to get labor done when you don't have a faculty, it takes a lot. So I'm right now thinking about the direction I want to go, because getting to this work and to those books is really that's why I went to school for 14, 15 years. And so I really need to decide what my direction is going to be very soon, because I want to get to that book too. I want to interview those folks too, right? I think it's interesting, fascinating, just like you do. And I just have to figure out how to work my way to get this work done.
Fair enough. It's a lot. It's a lot to handle too.
It
And I
is.
always say, like, do what you love, right? We're only here
Yeah,
for so long.
yeah.
Do what makes you happy.
You're right. You're right.
My last question to you, for UFO researchers, people in the media, for example, journalists and various communities, how do we emphasize Black voices within the UFO topic and generally any topic, but specifically UAP? How do we champion them and how do we raise them up?
I would say for African American and Native American voices in particular, you, you just have to decide that it's what you're going to do. And I really mean that, regardless of what the challenges might be and the forces against that. You have to make up your mind, and I'm talking about researchers, folks in the media, and so on. That these other voices, which they've heard hints of, right, are worth further investigation over against what they think they already know about UFO studies or UAP studies or the phenomena in general. Just have to make up your mind that this is going to be important to you as a researcher, as a media personality, whomever that might be, and that you're going to pursue it because filling gaps in knowledge gives us a much fuller picture of humanity, of religious experience, of who we are, than reproducing the gaps by doing the same thing and talking to the same people and prioritizing the same people over and over. I think filling those gaps, I think talking to folks we haven't talked to before gives us far more than not. We just have to make up in our mind and inside that we're going to commit to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. The circle reporting is such a huge thing, right? Interviewing, talking to the same people. It's a small community, but there's so many people out there in the world that are studying this and have such different insight. My other thing would suggest is to involve yourself in the community. Now, I think I'm very lucky. Toronto is one, if not the most multicultural city in the world. So, I'm surrounded by culture every day. I have no choice, but I
I've only
love
been
it
there
though.
once.
Yeah, I usually tell people if they're going to come, stay away in January and February because that's the coldest. But
Of
outside
course.
of that, spring, summer's beautiful in Ontario. Like it's something else. And our summers have been really nice, especially last summer. But I would say that I'm like, because I'm around and I have friends of all different cultures and genders, and it's just so normal for me in Toronto to have that. So specifically when I am traveling in the States, I do see more, depending on what region I'm in, that there is that lack of diversity. And then I see people that are not participating in it because it's just not around them or it's been segregated. Right. And urban development is a huge part of that. So I say to people that feel that they have lack of diversity around them, they might have to go search and find it and involve themselves in other communities that do champion it.
May I say one last thing?
For sure, yeah.
So, Chrissy, if I might call you that, I
Yeah,
do want to
yeah.
thank you for your time and for doing just what we're talking about. I have, as shy as I am, I have committed to doing these media engagements precisely because it's a means of getting the word out, not just about my work, but about these really important religious communities that I want other people to come study. I mean, because I can't do it all, and people who are going to treat them fairly. So journalists, scholars who have the training, but also the self-awareness, to do justice when they're studying these groups, which are largely marginalized. So I appreciate this time. I appreciate you, and I'm happy that we were able to have this conversation. Anytime you want to talk again, let me know.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you too for doing the work. It's not easy. And I think it's fascinating. We should be taking the time to learn more about the world and the people around us. Like that's the best part of being alive, I think, is meeting those people, hearing their stories and helping seeing the world through a different lens. That's why I'm here. That's why I have this podcast, because I think I talk about science and futurism and UFOs and technology, but I look at through the lens of culture because I think that all of these things, if it's soft sciences or hard sciences, affect us, but it affects who we are. And culture is the outcome of that. If we don't exist in those cultures and other people don't exist, science doesn't exist either. Well, it does, but it's not experienced, right? We're the ones experiencing it and making realities and perceptions from it. And by using those tools, and we have so many of them today that are advanced technology and sciences, that we need to make the right decisions now, and we need to include other people because it will change the way history and the future will look like for all of us.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And as I said to all my guests, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.